Professor Charity Hudley, thank you so much for joining us today for your time. You will be speaking to us a little bit about your research and linguistics. When we hear the word language, we often think of grammar and pronunciation, but the field of linguistics teaches us that there are many more elements to consider. What does it mean to study language through a linguistic lens?
Grammar and pronunciation are definitely fundamental to studying linguistics. But when we think about studying through a linguistic lens, we think of communication in all its forms and also the functions. So this will be the sound, it will be the way that words are put together, it would be the words themselves, how they're created, but it's also their social impact. What does it mean to think about your own background and culture and how you express it through spoken language, through written language, through signs and sounds? And what are the impacts of the ways that you communicate on your daily life? That's everything from the studying language in educational context on through the impacts of your language use in the workplace and how you use language to form relationships, both social and professional. So when we study language through that linguistic lens, we're looking at the interaction between those factors, the way the language is constructed by humans over time, and in real snapshots, the impact that the way that I speak, how that has on my social being.
So when we're talking about language varieties, what is the importance of acknowledging them, of being aware?
So, most of us have some kind of general concept of what languages are and how they're different. The importance of then adding language varieties to that is really challenging our ideas about how the stories of what is a language has been told. So, for example, you would say, okay, I know what English is, I know what Spanish is, I know what French is, but there's a whole story there behind that that has to do with power and history of nations and social groups. And language varieties allow us to see many more layers of language contact, language expression, differences across space and time, whether it be differences in English in Canada and English in the US, or differences in English on the same block in the same city, and how that English would be different by social factors that may include people's own history, where they've lived, their geographic history. It could be their social history by class and racial and ethnic identification. And language varieties also allow us to bring in a lot about choice. How I choose to use my languages, how I may choose to mix different languages together that people may see as different languages, but that I myself feel like are my language, right? And so getting the nuance of communication and how we do it individually and then socially requires that lens on language variety, in addition to thinking about languages as a whole kind of historical construct.
How do you think that might impact our personal biases in terms of as we slowly acknowledge or maybe notice things in our daily lives, or just the way that we perceive, the way that we express ourselves and what you just described?
I think it really starts to help us question who gets to decide what a language is. And it also then helps us question who gets to decide how we use language in different contexts. So I use the term standardized, not standard, to get at this idea is that there are certain people and processes in power, from governments to school systems, dictionaries, grammar book writers, who are making power decisions about what language is used as appropriate in different places. And so when we start to think about varieties, we start to think about who's included in those decisions, who's excluded, and what purpose does it serve, right? So whose language varieties are more excluded often, amazingly, lines up with people who have less social power and who have been discriminated upon historically. And so language varieties then become a proxy for other forms of discrimination, especially when they're less socially accepted in a given place. So I don't have to say in the United States, no Blacks allowed. I can just say African American English is not an accepted variety in schools and the workplace, and it has the same function as historical racism.
So language then connects directly to our sense of self, pride, lack, or empowerment. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I mean, who you are, your who, what you've learned from the people who have cared for you, who've taught you. And when you think about your language variety, it starts to put that type of learning, the ways that you're socialized in schools, more on par with what happens in schools and communities. And for some of us, it's really about the identity and expression, but it's also a matter of life and death. If I go into a situation and I don't have people who are willing to communicate with me and understand my language and language varieties, it can have direct implications on being able to learn, being able to receive health care. And so it really can, even if people are saying, oh, we're inclusive, we're welcome you, it really can be the thing that shows that, no, you're not really included. No, you're not welcome, because I'm not really taking time to communicate and have the language learning go both ways.
In your research, you address the fact that the field of linguistics faces a problem of inclusion and underrepresentation that persists, and also the need to recruit Black students to linguistics. More specifically, your new book titled Talking College, Making Space for Black Language Practices in Higher Education demonstrates how linguistic justice is crucial to advancing racial justice. Can you speak to us about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So both the United States and Canada have really rich linguistic traditions. The study of linguistics, the study of indigenous languages, study of African Americans from across the Black diaspora has been fundamental in research in linguistics in Canada, but also in the US. But one thing that you really notice when you look at the departments in both countries is that there's not a lot of Black people. So there's more people studying Black language in those linguistics departments than there are Black students and Black faculty. And what that does is change the questions. So when I am a person who doesn't speak the language, I don't have that racial identity, I'm going to ask different questions than someone who has a Black lived experience. And so it's really important for us to think about the ways that inclusion in studying language, this is in linguistics departments, in schools of education, speech and hearing, communications, language literacy, so I'm talking about across like a broad spectrum, will change the ways that racial justice will be studied and enacted on using those areas that people who study language care about. What we do in the book is look at it from both sides. We show how many Black students benefit from learning about language and culture across that large spectrum of areas. So not just linguistics, but speech and hearing and literature and culture. We also show what questions they have that are not answered in their current curriculum to really inspire people to think about, look, we have a real justice issue here, and that we hold and have knowledge that can really empower students. We've got to figure out how to get it to them in many places. And then we need to then take the questions that they have when we share the information we do have and let that lead the research that we do in the future.
The book is described as being for Black students and not just simply about them. Why approach the writing of this work in this way, and why was this angle important?
The angle was very important to me because of this history of linguists studying Black language and culture throughout the world, but having a real focus on that literature for white scholars, and asking questions that are of interest in particular to white scholars. And so this angle was important because we are inviting Black students into those research conversations and asking them to change them based on their own interests, their questions, and their reaction to the work. So that's why it's really important for us to speak directly to Black students. And in doing that, we wanted to create a text that Black students would want to share with each other, that they would want to have conversations with their families and communities, and that it would be accessible to students throughout the diaspora. That was really important to us, to have students on the project from Black experiences all over the world, so that that conversation could also be global and inclusive.
The book is also very pertinent for college faculty and staff because it offers insightful knowledge about how to create a liberating and linguistically just, and I quote, educational community for Black students. How so?
I think what it really does is invite people into these conversations in a way that they will start them in their own schools and communities. And what's so exciting, we know, and when you think about Black students, when they enter higher education, they often have newfound freedoms. They're studying things they've never had an opportunity to study before, right? It's just part of being at college. But at the same time, they also have a lot of options to think about how they want to express themselves to the world. They're learning about their racial and cultural history, as we see in the United States and a lot of places right now. There's a real pushback about learning about race and critical race theory in K-12. So when students get to college, they're learning about racial history, they're learning about justice, they're making decisions about how they want to live their lives. And we really wanted to, in this text, make those conversations easier for faculty and students and staff to have together by giving them really important questions that can kind of start these conversations. Because over the years, people have said, I want to ask these questions. I want to talk about these things. This could come from students or faculty or staff, but how do I get that conversation started? So we decided to kind of take that on and give a little bit of roadmap and guides for people to start those conversations. That's everything about talking about language use in writing, on to thinking about how do we create more linguistically inclusive research models. So we really take it from all of those angles, but with justice at the forefront. What do I need to do to create a more just learning environment in higher education?
This book and your work really touches upon a really important element of translating knowledge and having it live in the world, and also posing concrete gestures, engaging in concrete actions. We've seen many things in the last couple of years. We can notice many things on the social media in terms of performative practices to bring about change. But you're talking about questions and conversations. Given everything that we've also witnessed as a collective, as a world in the last 2 years with the Black Lives Movement, just different conversations around inclusivity and diversity, inclusion and diversity. What is the importance of having those honest, open, but often challenging conversations such as these at this particular point in time?
It's a great question. And we wrote this book as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement. What could we as academics, faculty, and students do to really contribute to longstanding issues of racial inequality in schools? And as linguists, we do sometimes know how to start the conversation in a way that's caring and restorative and just, but also really direct. And so we notice like that is often a challenge for people just to figure out how to get the conversation started. And so at this particular point in time, we need to be having more honest and direct conversations, asking real questions about why can't I express myself in my own language and variety in the school? What are the ramifications for that? How is language related to race and racism? And it's really important at this point in time in the pandemic because we've all been so isolated, but we've seen hostility grow, banning of books, banning of conversations, right? So we're just going directly against those ideas and models that we've seen and in a collective way, right? So there's many contributors and authors to this text, many lenses to it, so that it also models how to have a conversation that's larger and bigger in this time of isolation. So most of this book we wrote, we did some in person before the pandemic, but most of it has been virtual in Zoom meetings, in conversations like the ones we're having now, because what we don't want to see happen is the loss of the strongest thing that we have as Black scholars, which is community and collectivity during this time of pandemic. And so that's why it's important for us right now to be having the conversation, because that's the greatest strength we have as Black people, especially US formerly enslaved Black people. We understand that we are up against great powers, great forces. We can't do it alone.
And still along those lines of living in the world, bringing this knowledge, and when we reflect, carrying those insights that we may have out in the world, what do you think the importance is of actually exposing ourselves to language varieties, not just reading about it, not just theoretically, reading about it, as it often happens with different movements and discussions that happen maybe online even more now because we're in the state that we are in the pandemic, but actually engaging out in the world and exposing ourselves to that directly.
My students are more expert at me in harnessing the power of social media to keep those active conversations alive in safe places and spaces right now. So in the text, they talk about everything about from the use of TikTok to really share Black culture and language, on through Black Twitter as another way of doing that written expression. We talk about the power of social groups online where people get together and talk, but also where they share information, ideas, resources. And I think that's so exciting to see, the ways that virtual communication can serve some of those functions and keep us connected as we now start to, hopefully in the next couple of months, tiptoe back into person. And so you'll get a really good spin in this text of seeing how students were able to do that in the pandemic and think about their expression and think about their stories and listen to different varieties in a way that sometimes you may not if you were just mostly around people in your own community. So that's been really a really awesome way to see the intersection of learning about varieties and thinking about social media and virtual space come together in the text.
And as my last question, we often hear that language holds great power. We hear it, we say it, but how would you describe this and the need for us to really, truly become aware of it in our daily lives?
I think one of the strongest ways I think about the ways that language holds power and how we can become aware of it is who are we listening to, but who are we also around that whose voices aren't as strong or visible. That's people who are racialized minorities. That's people who may sign for language instead of speak. That's people who may communicate in ways that are not verbal. And thinking about the difference between verbal or written or signed expression and intelligence and power and thought. Rosina Lippy Green is a great scholar. She wrote an excellent book called English with an Accent. And in the text, she really encourages us to actively try to share at all times what she calls the burden of communication. So that is to seek to be understood and understand actively just as much as you expect someone to understand you. I think it's a great metaphor. It's tied to other practices in terms of thinking about sharing power, understanding those dynamics when they're explicit, right? When I really am exerting my power or influence in a situation. But other times when I'm just using my communication, my access to education or knowledge as a way to exert power over other people. And we're doing that through language. We're doing it through written and spoken language a lot, especially in educational contexts. And the sharing of that burden and trying to understand what someone is trying to say and what they mean, privileging that over the style of language is an active way that everybody in the university community can start to share that power and work to a more just learning environment. We all have great ideas. We all have lived experiences that are worth learning about. We can think really more creatively about how we do everything from university admissions to assessing writing, to thinking about who's a good speaker or presenter. We can value different aspects of not just the presentation of it, but the content and the variety. And I think that's a big thing that it seems obvious, but it's still so needed in universities. And the more that we really press on that and think about that in our daily lives, we'll start to get more practically towards the inclusion that we idealistically all want to see.
Thank you so much.